So about 7 months ago, I made a video going over killer reworks and whether they were positive or negative for their respective killer. It was a decent video at the time, but compared to my other videos nowadays, it was definitely starting to show its age. This was made during the time where I was still trying to figure out what editing style I wanted to go with, and I was still using my headset's mic rather than my current standalone one.
So I ended up sounding like this because of that.
Like, I know I don't always sound the best in my videos, but Jesus Christ, what the heck was going on here? Reminiscing aside, there were many more reworks I can talk about, so I've had a sequel to that video in the backlog for a little while now. And given that the state of the game right now is not really the best for neither side due to a certain overtuned killer and the palette density changes, I figured now would be a good time to revisit this topic to avoid fanning the flames more than they already have. Well, that and this topic won a video topic poll I put out a little while ago. With all this said, plus the fact I don't sound microwaved anymore and I got my editing style down, let's not waste any more time and start yapping. Unlike the first video, we'll begin with a negative killer rework this time to better contextualize the following positive rework. Starting us off with a killer I personally don't have much experience with, but he very nearly made it into the first video, we have Hillbilly. Hillbilly is one of the 3 original starter killers in this game, being released alongside the game when it came out back in 2016. Originally, Hillbilly worked much like he does today, having access to a chainsaw granting him unconditional mobility that also acts as a pallet and wall shredder on top of one-shotting survivors hit by it. The turning is a bit restrictive outside of about a second or so upon sprinting, but with add-ons this can be improved a fair bit. During the old days, Hillbilly was the best of the original 3 killers before Nurse came out and remained the second best killer before Spirit dropped. Hillbilly was also quite a popular killer as well, being praised for being hard as fuck to play, one of the hardest to play to this day in fact, but very rewarding and fun once you got him down pat. I was not in that crowd. He just wasn't for me. Plus I wasn't around during old DBD, so I never got to experience this outside of the 3.0.0 dev build you see me use for B-roll sometimes, including right now. Hillbilly would remain like this until patch 4.1.0, where Hillbilly would get his very controversial and largely disliked overheat rework. This essentially put Hillbilly's chainsaw on a massive restriction in order to limit feathering it and using it for constant map traversal. This rework also came with add-on changes that essentially made him have a poor add-on selection outside of the double engraving add-ons, which almost got nerfed thanks to their usage. Essentially, this rework tanked Hillbilly's play rate and popularity overnight, being unrewarding compared to his fellow killer competition when considering how much effort the Hillbilly player has to put in to learn curves and his chainsaw overheat and sensitivity in order to get shit done. It just wasn't worth the time investment anymore, and only his most dedicated players were really the only ones who still stuck around. It remained like this until patch 7.5.0, the Alan Wake paragraph, where he received his second rework. And speaking of said rework, the Overdrive rework to Hillbilly was one of the biggest zero to hero stories this game has ever seen. Essentially, this rework reverted Hillbilly back to how he was before the overheat rework and fine-tuned the chainsaw's collision a bit. However, they also added the ability for Hillbilly to overcharge his chainsaw by constantly using it, allowing him to reach even faster speeds for a limited time. At the time of release, Overdrive Hillbilly was an absolute menace, easily causing him to go from a C tier, maybe B tier at best killer, all the way back to his former S tier position from the old days, with many people around this time considering him to be stronger than Blight. Throughout the year, Hillbilly would get some fine-tuning and general minor nerfs to Overdrive in order to make him more reactable for survivors, and he's overall in a pretty decent spot currently, even if he still remains a top 5 killer. As for his add-ons, well, they're mostly still pretty rough, and his best one's an Eerie, so that kinda stinks. But they're a bit better than Overheat Era's add-on selection, so I'll give it that at the very least. Overall, while playing Hillbilly during the Overheat rework era was absolutely the worst time to be a Hillbilly player, the current era with Overdrive is by far the best time since it makes an already good killer even better just for playing the game. And listen, while I have little experience with Hillbilly since I just don't vibe with his gameplay loop, he's just not for me personally, I do acknowledge that learning him is absolutely worth it if you're willing to put up with one of the hardest learning curves in the game. He's popular for a reason, and a lot of people like the challenge, so overall the Overdrive rework was a home run outside of a couple balancing hiccups on release. The Alan Wake patch was notable for bringing Overdrive Hillbilly into the game, but this patch also contained Sadako's second rework, the Condemn Lock rework. For a brief history lesson before we get to this, Sadako has always been a pub stomper because of people not knowing how to handle her Condemn mechanic, especially if she has a Condemn build on and her manifest states. However, Sadako on release was buns without her Eerie Tape add-on, which was very different back then, and playing in a way that focused on stacking Condemned. She was legit a bottom 5 killer in the game, which was rather disappointing for me personally. I think Sadako's pretty badass. She's the reason I hopped back on DBD years later after I stopped playing, and look what I'm doing now 2 years later. Back on topic, Sadako could only spread Condemn through the TV she was teleporting through, and her teleports disabled the TVs longer than survivors shutting them off themselves. This basically made it really hard to get Condemn spreading and many more kills unless you ran Eerie Tape, which at the time reactivated the last 4 TVs you teleported through if you got a hit 8 seconds after teleporting, and playing in a way that encouraged slugging and corralling survivors to TVs you wanted to teleport to. This playstyle was hated by survivors, and in tandem with her overall weaknesses caused behavior to rework her. Her first rework made her a lot stronger, making her Condemn range infinite at the cost of teleporting having a cooldown, making her impossible to stun with pallets while demanifested, which, yeah, she was stunnable while demanifested back then, I probably should have touched on that earlier. Made her TVs reactivate sooner, and survivors disabling them made them take longer to reactivate, which now gave an actual incentive to interact with the TVs alongside the much easier to spread Condemn thing, and most critically, hitting a survivor with a tape broke the tape and progressed their Condemn bar. The counterplay was made easier by allowing survivors to deposit their tapes into any TV, but Sadako's newly reworked Eerie Tape add-on reverted this back to how it used to be, and this, combined with add-ons like Mother's Comb and Ring Drawing, made Sadako intercepting survivors with tapes extremely lethal and made it very easy to absolutely decimate your average matches. She was still relatively easy to counter if you knew what you were doing, but most of the player base did not, so the resulting outcry resulted in Sadako's second rework, which was a middle ground between the old and first rework versions. To start with this, Sadako regained her unlimited teleport, but the Condemn range was no longer global, instead spreading Condemn around on survivors near any active TV, including the ones she teleported through. Sadako no longer breaks TVs by hitting, instead by hooking survivors, which doesn't do anything to the Condemn bar anymore. Instead, Sadako hooking a survivor with Condemn on them regardless of a tape or not will lock in up to 3 bars of Condemn progress per hook, making it uncleansable from then on out. Additionally, Sadako's demanifest stun immunity and TV cooldowns carried over to this version. And finally, survivors with tapes now had to find the furthest TV to deposit their tape in, just like the original version. Overall, it was an objectively negative rework in terms of the killer's performance, as Sadako basically went back to her first version with some pretty decent buffs sprinkled in to get her out of the bottom tier and get her more in line with most killers. Granted, yeah, she's still not great since she still has to put in a lot of effort for middling returns compared to some other killers, similar to what Overheat Hillbilly had to deal with. But, at least in my opinion, she's not really a bottom 5 anymore compared to some other killers nowadays. She definitely has it a bit better right now compared to some other killers in this day and age. Like, look at Trapper, Skull Merchant, Ghostface, Legion. They're not doing too hot right now. The biggest issue with this rework outside of tiering, however, is that it kinda put Sadako in this weird spot where her playstyle's kind of all over the place and contradictory. The Condemn mechanic naturally rewards slugging in order to avoid removing more than 3 bars from hooking, but it also guarantees those 3 bars are staying at the cost of having to put in more work later instead of trying to go for the full Condemn on the spot from the start. This just makes what you're supposed to do with her tricky for players new to her, and don't even get me started on people just trying to figure out what she does, since there is a lot going on in her kit and the fact that she's had several reworks. Overall, while I very much enjoy Sadako, she's definitely in a bit of an awkward spot right now thanks to her second and current rework, mainly since Condemn in its current function has proven to be hard to balance. It also doesn't help that Eerie Tape got gutted this patch to be whatever the fuck this is. Like seriously, it went from being her best add-on for 2 versions to her worst and probably one of the worst add-ons in the entire game. I feel bad for anyone who stockpiled this thing back in the day. An ability to sell add-ons for blood points sounds really nice right about now. Look, Sadako's been on a wild ride throughout her lifespan, but at least she had a power she could do things with. Leatherface, whoo boy. It's not a secret at this point that Bubba Sawyer here got his paragraph chapter rushed thanks to Nightmare on Elm Street intruding. When he first came out, he pretty much had no power. Well, technically he had one, but getting value out of it in a normal setting was so difficult you may as well be better off using the sledge to do the work for you. Bubba's chainsaw did not have overheat during this time, and it only worked for the equivalent of one chainsaw charge, period. You couldn't extend it with tokens, it was just that single set of sweeps and you were done. As you'd imagine, this made getting downs with this thing painful, unless the survivor made a massive mistake or you were right up against them in a dead zone. Essentially, this thing was only really useful for quickly breaking pallets or camping hooks. Other than those scenarios, you rarely got value out of this thing. Oh, and getting put into a tantrum pretty much made the chase end and feel somehow even worse than how it already does. At least the tantrum screen did not act like this during the duration on live nowadays. Even worse, thanks to being rushed, Bubba had shared Hillbilly's add-ons, meaning the majority of them just did not work when he first dropped. As a result of all this, Bubba got reworked to now have tokens to extend his chainsaw sweeps, got his tantrums cleaned up to feel less shitty, overheat to prevent feathering and limiting camping a bit, and actually having a functional and separate add-on list from Hillbilly now. This should have been how Bubba released from the start, but hey, better late than never, I guess. It was technically a rework and a massively positive change for Bubba, so overall, there's not really a whole lot else to say here. It was just objectively a great rework to help fix up his sorry state thanks to getting rushed in development. On to an actual positive rework. Legion. Legion has always been a controversial and hated killer for a lot of reasons, ranging from the bait and switch trailer, moonwalking Legion, his current iteration, mending simulator, all that jazz. But hey, as annoying as he can be nowadays for some people, he's certainly a massive improvement from what he was originally. When Legion came out, there was no frenzy hit comboing, but instead he could just run backwards to avoid triggering chases to force survivor mend bars to deplete while he was on them. Additionally, the combo of Frank's mixtape and stab wound study allowed him to just stab people repeatedly until the mend bar gave out. Thank God I wasn't around during this time because this genuinely sounded awful. And it was! He was both underpowered and unhealthy at the same time, as one survivor would just be subjected to this while everyone else just cranked gens and left Legion with only one kill. Now, not all Legions played like this, obviously, but it was bad enough to cause survivors to DC on site if Legion was detected as the killer. Eventually, Legion got all these oversights and issues sorted out, but he remained pitifully weak, which resulted in Legion receiving a rework, which made him slightly less pitifully weak. In this rework, the dashes were changed to now include a chaining mechanic where chaining 4 slashes on non-deep wounded survivors would cause the 5th one to one-shot regardless of health state. The power recharges immediately when ending instead of after the fatigue, and Legion speed would increase by 0.2 meters per second every hit that continued the chain while in the power, capping out at 0.8 meters per second. This rework, in tandem with a ton of changes back in patch 2.7.0 to rein in the abusable parts of Feral Frenzy, gave Legion the ability to utterly decimate players who group up by threatening with an insta-down. Although granted, this does not happen a whole lot since the main counterplay is just split up. I'm not really sure what else to say here. The power was extremely problematic on release, and much of Legion's changelog was them getting ironed out, with the core part of the power remaining intact. And the only major power design thing getting changed includes the chaining mechanic getting added and the multiple iterations of how Deep Wound works, since Legion is irrevocably tied to that mechanic. Overall, Legion is a pretty simple killer with not a whole lot to discuss in the rework department besides the new power mechanic additions I just discussed, but them becoming much healthier for the game, even if he's still annoying from time to time, is something I would still consider to be a win. Plus, that same patch also gave him his banger chase theme, so there's that as well. Finally, the last killer we're going to talk about today is one I wanted to save for last, since this killer rework was legendary for how bad it was. It was so poorly thought out on paper and in execution that this thing didn't even make it to the live game. This was something entirely stuck and lost to time on the PTB, the Twins rework. For years, Twins were scheduled to receive a rework thanks to Twins' gameplay loop being pretty much boiled down to slug or lose, since playing Charlotte like your average killer was and still is a recipe for disaster. Their optimal gameplay was injuring someone as Charlotte, downing them with Victor, then have Victor go latch onto someone else or guard a high traffic area or objective before having Charlotte go pick up. Twins are extremely effective in what they do. And they're one of, if not the only killer in the game where grouping up is actually a pretty decent idea, since that tends to shut Victor down because he can get kicked in his cooldown phase after downing someone or the off chance he misses a leap. However, this is also not very fun for most Survivor players, and I'd be willing to bet the two would have gotten reworked a lot sooner had Twins been played more and wasn't so riddled with bugs since their release. Speaking of that rework, to summarize it, it basically made Twins go from an A tier to arguably better than Nurse depending on who you asked. And if you actually look at it, it isn't hard to see why that claim was being made. Starting with the lighter stuff, Twins got a bunch of buffs to their switching times and unbinding Victor, helping them feel smoother to play, and Charlotte gets haste every time Victor got a down or pinned someone in a locker in order to help her get to that survivor for the pickup, the whole point of this to help reduce her reliance on slugging. This is all well and good, but the real problems came in once you saw how people were using the new 10% haste to make the slugging even easier, and, more importantly, how Victor functioned now. Victor essentially worked the same as before, only with two major changes. He can no longer be kicked if he successfully hit a survivor, and he can no longer latch onto healthy survivors, instead doing so if the hit downed the survivor. In the simplest of terms, Victor now had insane DPS, and if you were facing a good Twins player, there was pretty much no consistent counter to him since he could still pounce over resources, and the only way to kick him would be either after he downed someone or he missed a pounce. Yeah, elevations like stairs still gave him trouble, but that's not impossible for Victor to deal with if he's patient enough. Plus, it's map dependent. If anything, the best counter to this version of Twins was praying one of the trillion bugs Twins still had kicked in. Long story short, this entire rework basically got recalled and scrapped, leaving Twins to come onto live with only her number changes, a more lenient system to manually recalling Victor, and the quality of life changes that made Victor glow red or white to determine whether he's kickable or not. Overall, say what you want about the Myers rework, but at the very least, that one made it out of the BTB even if people aren't very fond of it still. The Twins one was so atrocious it never even saw the light of day. Charlotte and Victor had essentially terrorized the game for a week, then went back to being one of the least played killers in the game despite their strength, mainly because of their unending list of bugs. Dead by Daylight has had a bunch of killer reworks over the years, enough for me to make 2 entire videos on this topic. As always, some were well received and brought new life into their respective killers, while others failed either due to general unpopularity or completely neutered the killer. Now, if I'm still making videos and playing DBD when this happens, I can definitely make a 3rd video on this subject, but I'm not quite sure who else to talk about aside from Myers. So if enough reworks happen in the future, I would be down to talk about this again. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more, feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and join the community Discord server. Let me know in the comments what your experiences were with these killers, whether it be before their reworks or after. And with that in mind, cheers!